Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Bishar Dumani. I'm Director of Middle East Studies here at Brown University. It's great to see you here, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Khaled Fahmy. Now, in Middle East Studies, as you know, we have a reputation for not making introductions so we can save time, but I realize that a lot more people are going to be watching this online, so I will read part of what we distributed to you about the introduction. Khaled Fahmy is the Sultan Qaboos bin Said Professor of Modern Arabic Studies, Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, University of Cambridge. He's also AMES Director of Studies, King's College, Cambridge. Khaled Fahmy is a historian of the modern Middle East with a specialty in the social and cultural history of 19th century Egypt. Born and raised in Egypt, Khaled studied economics for his BA, then saw the light, and then political science for his MA, and then saw a bigger light. Both degrees he received from University of Cairo, American University of Cairo, AUC. He then went to the University of Oxford, where he wrote his DPhil dissertation on the history of the Egyptian army during the first half of the 19th century. That is a classic book that I've taught many times in my graduate courses, and is still one of the major works of this generation. After receiving his doctorate in 1993, Khaled moved to the United States, where he first worked at Princeton University. At that time, you really needed a very big light to get out. And then to New York University, which has been really a powerhouse of knowledge production on the Middle East and training of PhD students. After 17 years in the United States, he returned to his home country in 2010. I remember that moment very well. And joined his alma mater, AUC, as chair of the Department of History. Very soon after, the world seems to change. In 2013, Khaled returned to the United States, this time as a visiting fellow at Columbia University, and then as a visiting professor at Harvard University. He recently joined the University of Cambridge, and his forthcoming publication, In Quest of Justice, Islamic Law and Forensic Medicine in Modern Egypt, is due this fall of 2018, from the University of California Press. Now, I've done my duty. He's got a great CV and a great person to bring to the Peter Green lecture, but I would like to say a personal note, if I may. It's really a pleasure to introduce Khaled Fahmy, a person that I greatly admire and respect. First and foremost, because he is Khaled. A man of great integrity, warmth, generosity, and humbleness. In the crowded field of Ottoman Egyptian history, which has attracted some of the best and the brightest, Khaled stands out as a rigorous and innovative social and cultural historian who combines meticulous archival research and critical theory with great storytelling skills and elegant prose. Khaled is an engaged scholar in the best tradition of that word. He's worked hard all his life to decolonize scholarship and liberate archives from the rusted iron grips of authoritarian states, nationalist mythologies, and colonial epistemologies. He's a model for all of us who strive to live by our principles and who have the courage to follow their hearts. I welcome Khaled Fahmy to Brown University.
Thank you, Bishara, very much for this wonderful and kind introduction. It means a lot to me coming from you. I feel very privileged to be here and envious of all of you to be in this program, which is something we have been following closely, one of the most successful Middle East studies programs anywhere in this country and indeed in the world, and it's mostly thanks to Bishara and his stewardship of this amazing program. I prepared a lengthy talk, hopefully not too long. I have some slides that in case you get bored, you can watch. But basically, I want to share with you work I have been doing for many years. The other day, I was sharing with Elliot Kohler, a common friend, some memories about when I started working on this project, and I said it was 15 years. He said, Khaled, no, you forget. It's much longer than this. So I've been working on this for nearly a quarter of a century, this project. It's when I first started working on it. It's actually even before finishing my PhD dissertation. So this is a project that is very close to my heart. It's I basically grew with it, not only academically but also politically as well. I'd like to try and situate it with regards my engagement with how we do intellectual and social history in modern Middle Eastern studies. My period is the middle decades of the 19th century. The country I work on is Egypt. This period, the middle decades of the 19th century, as is well known, witnessed the first inklings of the intellectual, cultural, and political effervescence that is often referred to in English as the Renaissance or Al-Nahda. This exciting period of modern Arab history has naturally been the subject of countless studies that followed artists, writers, artists, translators, scientists, and linguists in their critical engagement both with European modernity, Hadatha, and with Islamic tradition, Turath. Most famously, Albert Hourani, in his 1962 classic, The Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age, set out to study how leading Arab luminaries in the 19th and 20th century grappled with liberalism, his euphemism for Western ideas, and celebrated those luminaries who succeeded in grafting European Enlightenment thought upon Islamic heritage. And while this Eurocentric approach had its obvious shortcomings which Hourani himself was the first to acknowledge, the near obsession with the question of provenance, that is, the European provenance of the Arab Nahda, had dominated scholarship for many years. So when I embarked upon this project more than 20 years ago, I wondered if it is possible to write a history of Al-Nahda, primarily an intellectual and artistic experience, without necessarily following an intellectual history approach. Specifically, I wondered how the Arab and Egyptian Renaissance of the 19th century would look like if approached corporeally, that is, if one takes the human body as one's unit of analysis. So I have been interested less in studying how ideas of equality, liberty, or constitutionalism made their way from their lofty European origins to be transplanted into the Arab, Ottoman, and Muslim body politic, than in coming as close as possible to the bodies of average and less than average Egyptians and to study their mundane quotidian lives. After many years of research in the Egyptian National Archives, I have finally finished a monograph that offers what I hope is an engaging account of such topics as homicide, sewage, rape, miasmas, and legal torture. By zooming in on medical, legal, and public hygienic reforms, my book asks how our understanding of Egyptian modernity would differ if pursued not via studying schools, newspapers, or printing presses, but by having a close look at cemeteries, slaughterhouses, and cesspools. Rest assured, though, I know you're still eating, so I don't want to make you lose your appetite. I'm going to concentrate instead on the lofty topic of dissection. So I hope to illustrate in the remaining few minutes why I take dissection seriously, because I think studying dissection can help us understand a lot about this business of the Arab Nahda. Human bodies in 19th century Egypt were opened for all kinds of reasons. I want to concentrate specifically this afternoon on the medical side of it, but I want to also point out that human bodies were also opened up for forensic legal purposes, that is to provide medical proof for confusing legal cases, homicide cases. This is the second half of my book about which I'm saying few things. I'll touch upon it when it comes to Shari'a. But basically, in terms of just introducing the topic, I'd like to say that dissections and autopsies are fundamentally important to follow how medicine and law, respectively, were radically transformed in 19th century Egypt. Studying why and by whom the human body was opened up, I believe, can go a long way to elucidate how medicine and law, the twin pillars of Egyptian Renaissance and Egyptian modernity, were radically reconstituted in 19th century Egypt. Studying how cadavers were opened up and examining the reactions such a disturbing practice elicited can, I believe, shed more light on the Arab Nahda than could be had by tracing the intellectual history of liberalism. For dissections raise the question of ownership of the human body. To whom does the body belong? Does it belong to the person inhabiting it, or to the modern state that lays a new claim on it? Does it belong to the community in which it used to live and which honors and protects it after death, or to God, who, according to classic Islamic dogma, entrusted it to man to fulfill his wish in this world? In whose name and with what authority were bodies opened up? And who had an interest in pursuing such a disturbing practice that was assumed by some to violate norms, religious norms, and to go against deep social mores? In an attempt to engage with these questions, it may be helpful to look at an oil painting displayed in a seldom visited, nearly deserted museum of medical history at Qasr al-Aini, which is the name of the Faculty of Medicine at Cairo University. Qasr al-Aini is the place I study, so you'll hear me repeating this word often this afternoon. So this is a museum of medical history in the Cairo University School of Medicine, Qasr al-Aini. Like many museums in Egypt, this museum is as rich in its contents as the captions of these contents are tantalizingly brief and frustratingly incomplete. They're closer to being items in an inventory list than texts to inform, educate, or edify. The caption of this painting merely says the following: the first dissection lesson in Egypt. The painting is not signed, and the caption gives no date, nor does it identify the painter. As cryptic as it is, I believe this painting makes a strong statement about the history of dissection in 19th century Egypt, and it tells us a lot about the strong resistance this practice purportedly elicited from people who believed that this practice violated the basic tenets of Islam. So what does this painting say about Islam and dissection? At first glance, and with no knowledge about its date or its artist, it seems we have only wild guesses to go by. For like the event it commemorates, this painting is one of a kind, and it is difficult to situate it in an art historical context that can help us explain the artist's meaning. Even if we insert the painting into the context of the rich classical Arabic medical literature, that is replete with manuscripts containing anatomical illustrations, a context that I do not believe it belongs to, these illustrations do not depict anatomy lessons. Rather, as Professor Emily Savage Smith has argued, these anatomical illustrations represent, quote, a highly schematic approach to human anatomy and could serve as a reasonable aide-memoire for the user, even though they might give an inadequate representation of the structures themselves, unquote. However, by comparing our painting to early European Renaissance woodcuts that illustrate human anatomy lessons, especially those lessons that were performed in Italian medical colleges, a central feature presents itself as a possible clue. Down the centuries, these European images point to an ongoing dialogue, if not a tension, between the dissected body on the one hand, and on the other, a medical text, which is being recited aloud by a lector sitting behind an elevated lectern, and which belongs, that is, this tradition belongs to medical authorities that can be traced all the way back to Aristotle and Galen. Some of the earliest European Renaissance anatomical illustrations expressed this tension quite vividly. Even the famous Rembrandt's painting, The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulp, has been interpreted by William Heckscher in his classic 1958 study in this light, pointing out that the gazes of at least 5 of the 7 onlookers are directed not at the body being dissected, but at a book placed at the bottom right-hand corner of the painting. Heckscher argued that these anatomical paintings do not show us so much what had been seen as what was known to exist. Simply put, this tension was about what has precedence over the other, the text or the cadaver. Are the senses, especially those of touch and sight, to be trusted as to replace the word? Is the corpus of classical medical literature to be discussed in favor of the direct observation of the dissected cadaver, or does the corpse only corroborate the teachings of the ancients? By contrast, our Egyptian painting lacks explicit references to any text, except perhaps the names of classical medical authors running along the amphitheater walls. At the center are the names of Galen, Aristotle, and Hippocrates, Herophilus, whereas the side walls are adorned by the names of Abu al-Qasim, Ibn al-Bitar, Ibn al-Faraj. So curiously, Ibn Sina's name is missing. However, there is another important, if subtle, reference to this telltale tension between cadaver and text at the very center of our painting. For surrounding the cadaver, the painter has placed a group of ulama, the custodians and interpreters of the texts, one of them gesticulating excitingly at what is taking place in front of him. Compared to a much more famous dissection scene, the frontispiece of Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica in 1543, neither anatomist nor dissected cadaver demand our attention in our painting. Rather, it is the group of religious scholars who occupy center stage, and the painter arranged them in such a way as to obstruct the view of the students, thus preventing direct access to the cadaver, ostensibly the source of knowledge about the internal structure of the human body. Autopsy, which literally means to see with one's own eyes, is thus thwarted and obstructed by religion. This reading of the painting, wherein religion stands in the way of science, gains further credence by identifying the artist and dating the painting. I spent many years trying to identify it. I failed, but my friend and colleague Anne-Marie Moulin, who herself is a specialist in 19th century Egyptian medicine, has managed to identify the painter as a certain Strikalowski. Now, I did get a lot of research trying to identify who this Strikalowski is. I discovered there were 2 of them, most likely brothers, Nicholas and Roman, who were active in Egypt in the 1930s and 1940s. They dabbled in many things. One famous thing that I discovered, not famous but interesting, is that one of them illustrated the 1949 edition of Dar al-Ma'arif of Khalil Dimna, which interestingly has an introduction by Taha Hussein. They also they have postcards of various sites in Egypt, touristic sites, but most famously, Roman was an illustrator of the medical books in the Qasr al-Aini in the 1930s. And both brothers have this fantastic collection of watercolors, 52 watercolor paintings housed in the Smithsonian Institution of Egyptian Bees. They are beautiful, and you can see them online. You can zoom in. It's very high resolution. It's a beautiful collection. The point is, however, that whether it is Roman or his brother, either of them didn't work in Egypt except in the 1930s. With more than a century separating him from the event he was commemorating, one wonders from where Strikalowski derived his understanding of the circumstances surrounding the opening in Cairo of a medical school based on dissection. An obvious source, although slightly misleading, as I will argue, would be the copious writings of Dr. Antoine Barthélemy Klaw. This is my hero, the French founder or founding director of the school. There is also little doubt that the turban teacher depicted in the painting is that of Dr. Klaw himself. So who's this guy? Born in Grenoble in 1793, Dr. Klaw, or Klobbe, as he famously came to be known in Egypt, studied with Javier Bichat, the famous anatomist that Foucault writes his book, Birth of the Clinic, on. He studied with him back in France. In 1825, Klaw arrived in Egypt seeking employment in the budding administration of Mehmet Ali Pasha. In December of that year, that is in 1825, the young doctor was introduced to the resourceful governor who had been ruling Egypt ostensibly on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan, but practically in his own right for nearly a quarter of a century. A few years prior, Mehmet Ali had experimented with founding a standing army, only to find out that the difficult way that the men he so laboriously gathered from their villages were falling prey to all kinds of diseases in barracks and in military camps. A military medical corps needed to be founded, so the Pasha thought, and it is for that purpose that he sought the help of the French consul in Egypt, Drovetti, to secure the services of a physician who could save the lives of his soldiers and stop the drain on his expenses. This first encounter between both men was to have a profound impact on the future of the Pasha's army and indeed on Egypt at large. For in this meeting, Klaw advised Mehmet Ali that although he could secure the medical services of many of his countrymen, doing so would cost the Pasha dearly. It would be wiser and cheaper, he said, to found a medical college to train hundreds of native doctors and pharmacists. Crucially, he argued, these native doctors should receive their education in Arabic in order to be able to communicate with their patients. Now, it's very important to stop here and ponder the significance of this momentous decision. Klobbe, a Marseille-trained, French-speaking doctor, advising Mehmet Ali, a Kavala-born, Turkish-speaking Ottoman governor, to found a medical school in Egypt where the Arabic-speaking natives would receive state-of-the-art education in their mother tongue. I say this because I want to say upfront here that this is not India. We're not talking about a similar experience with what the British were doing in India. I make a strong argument, or I hope I am making a strong argument, that this is not a typical colonial encounter. There's something different here. No sooner had Klaw convinced the Pasha to set aside the necessary funds for funding a medical school, it was founded in this location first outside Cairo, in a place called Abu Zabal, for the first 10 years, and then moved to its new location, Qasr al-Aini, closer to the city, and then acquiring its new name in 1837. But for the first 10 years, this is where it was found. This painting is also in this deserted museum of medical history in Qasr al-Aini. He encountered a serious problem when, soon after he founded his school. This is what he says in his memoirs. When he wrote to the Pasha, telling him that the medical education he had in mind would be squarely based on dissecting human cadavers, the Pasha replied firmly that cadavers were not to be touched. In his memoirs, Klaw explains how, undeterred, he managed to overcome this formidable barrier. Quote, I harbored the hope that one day I would vanquish this prejudice, even though I clearly noted the profound disgust of the students and the fanatical opposition of the ulama, with whom I had communication on the subject. I applied myself to winning the confidence of Sheikh al-Islam al-Arusi, an important person who enjoyed a high reputation for holiness in the country. When I approached the question of anatomy, he would not give a single concession. His principal argument was that according to religion, cadavers could feel pain, to which I concurred, but I added that bodies would decompose and become the prey of worms after death anyway. The Sheikh then argued that medical treatises published on the subject should suffice for the instruction of the students. I responded that the theory provides no more than incomplete notions. A watchmaker, I told him, who has to repair watches, does he need not to understand the whole mechanism? Moreover, does he not have to put together and take apart the various pieces before he can understand how they operate? This image struck him, and I managed to obtain a tacit agreement to study anatomy, but to act with the greatest discretion and to do so in secret. Unquote. It is clear that Klaw is referring here to the theory of natural theology, which simply put argues that design implies a designer. This theory has become famous in England in 1802 with the publication of William Paley's book, simply titled Natural Theology, in which he used the matchmaker analogy. This book was translated into French the following year, 1803, and Klaw might have read the French translation, but it's difficult to ascertain this point. Be that as it may, in his memoirs published in 1949, Klaw describes how, having received the tacit approval of the ulama, he proceeded to deal with the prejudices of the students. After placating them by promising that he would never apply the scalpel to a Muslim's body and that he would only work on the bodies of black soldiers who work progressed slowly and cautiously on learning descriptive anatomy, and the first dissection lesson was conducted in 1829. Then, on the 20th of June, 1829, while watching the physiology lesson of a colleague, Klaw was attacked by a student with a knife in his hand. Only by an instinctive move of his arm did he manage to avoid a fatal wound. The attacker was immediately grabbed and disarmed, and Klaw ordered him detained in the hospital's jail. But the incident left Klaw completely demoralized. Quote, I admit that from the time I was hit by the young fanatic man, a deep despondency seized me. Sacrificing one's life, giving up one's peace in order to conquer the prejudices of a people, to develop their intelligence, to extend to them the benefits of civilization, only to be rewarded by indifference, if not hatred, this thought overwhelmed my soul. Unquote. This image of Klaw Bey as a man of science, rationality, and political acumen, confronting religious obscurantism and popular prejudice is what he himself stressed in his numerous publications, both in Arabic and in French. Never a man to miss an opportunity to blow his own horn, Klaw Bey's reputation in Egypt rested more on the writings of his students and his students' students. Most notably, in 1935, one of those students published an account of the history of his school, Qasr al-Aini, and of the heroic feats of Klaw Bey in overcoming religious opposition to dissection. This author's name is famous because it is Naguib Mahfouz, who was the sub-dean of the school a century after its foundation, and it is most likely that it is through Mahfouz's account, published, as I said, in 1935, and not through Klaw Bey's memoirs, published in 1949, that Sterkalovsky got his inspiration for his iconic picture of Klaw Bey. Mahfouz, in his account, repeats the story about the encounter and his attempt on his life. He exaggerates it, and he makes the incident connected to a lesson not in physiology, as Klaw says in his memoirs, but an anatomy lesson. This is what Mahfouz says. Before critically analyzing these accounts of European science confronting Islamic opposition, it is worth noting that Dr. Naguib Mahfouz is the reason why our famous novelist, Naguib Mahfouz, gets his name. The story goes that when the novelist's mother was in labor delivering him, and when the midwife who had been fetched to help with the delivery panicked, seeing that this would be a difficult labor, a decision was taken to fetch the most famous gynecologist of his time, Dr. Naguib Mahfouz. Following the successful delivery, the parents decided to name the baby after the famous doctor. What makes this anecdote interesting is that Naguib Mahfouz, the novelist, had something in common with his namesake's hero, Klaw. For towards the end of his life, Naguib Mahfouz, the novelist, was also the victim of an assassination attempt. Like the great doctor, Mahfouz, the novelist, was stabbed in the neck by a religious fanatic who had found his novel, Children of Gabalawi, offensive for the manner it allegedly depicted the divine being. Islam then stands accused of being in opposition to free expression, as it has been accused of being an obstacle to science and enlightenment. But let us leave aside the question of Islam and literature and attend to the question at hand, Islam's position to science in general, medicine in particular, and dissection in 19th century Egypt, to be even more particular. As gripping as Klaw's account of his encounter with Azhari ulama is, it raises more questions than it answers. Was he correct in sensing that their opposition to dissection was doctrinally based? Did the ulama whom he reached out to really believe that cadavers could feel pain, or did their opposition to dissection have other reasons? And sticking to our painting and to the animated students following this historic lesson, who were these students and how did they end up in the school? What careers did they pursue upon graduation, and what social status did they enjoy as bearers of medical diplomas? More importantly, did they share with their professor his belief that science and religion represented two distinct fields of thought, or did they agree with classical Muslim physicians, those physicians whose names they read on the walls of their classrooms, in rejecting such binary distinction? In light of the ulama's ostensible opposition to dissection, as well as Mehmet Ali's directive to Klaw to proceed with caution, the presence of the guards points to that we see at the here, this guard there. It points to the purported hostility of the wider society to what was going on inside these hallowed halls. Did dissection elicit negative reactions from non-elite Egyptians? And if so, what was their understanding of modern medicine? Furthermore, and when we realize that opening cadavers was performed not only for the purposes of medical pedagogy, but was also routinely practiced to ascertain the cause of death for legal purposes, how did non-elite Egyptians react to this encroachment on what was literally a matter of life and death? Moreover, dissections and post-mortem examinations were part of a much larger set of practices by which the newly evolving modern state was controlling Egypt's population. Examples of these practices include registration at birth, vaccination against smallpox, conscription, branding of criminals, a routine medical examination of students, workers, sailors, and soldiers, and having a stamped certificate to bury the dead in order for the state to update its vital statistics. I'm very fond of this particular small piece of paper. The original is no bigger than this, but I designed an entire class that ends with this particular small parchment because I think it is as badly written as it is, and there are many of them in the Egyptian National Archives. It is a testimony to the enormous self-confidence that this state in the 19th century in Egypt felt about itself and had, because what we have here is an assumption that every single death could be accounted for. And this is incredible. And we see where this comes from in other archival entities. We see what led to it. We see the contestation of it, and I'm going to mention towards the end one such contestation. What happens when people forge certificates like this? What happens when things go wrong? but for the time being, this is an amazing tool of power. How did people understand the family of this person whose death is being ascertained in this small piece of paper saying this person died of diarrhea, age so-and-so, in this neighborhood, and then certified by the resident doctor of the neighborhood. This then is how I attempt to answer this large question of Islam's supposed opposition to dissection. I contrast different doctrinal positions articulated by religious scholars with actions taken by doctors who themselves were graduates of Quran schools before joining the medical school, as well as reactions of lower-class Egyptians to this disturbing practice. So 3 layers of analysis. The ulama and what they wrote, these doctors who themselves had a religious training before they joined the medical school, and average lower-class Egyptians and how they understood this new edifice. So let us start with the doctrinal position of the fuqaha and the ulama, the jurists and the scholars of religion. Once again, Emily Savage-Smith comes to our rescue. In an exhaustive study on the position of Islamic fiqh regarding the post-classical Islamic fiqh regarding dissection, she concluded that there was no, quote, explicit legal or religious strictures banning dissection. Indeed, many Muslim scholars lauded the study of anatomy primarily as a way of demonstrating the design and wisdom of God, unquote. Naturally, the issue for post-classical jurists was never one of dissection for medical or forensic purposes. Rather, the question was typically posed to illustrate some fiqhi principle and to clarify the hierarchy of various fiqhi rules. For example, to stress the importance of the principle of the right of the property owner to his or her property, the jurists raised the hypothetical question of whether or not it was permissible to open the belly of a dead man who had swallowed some coins or jewelry to return, and then died in order to return this property to its rightful owner. Ibn Hazm, who died in 1064, gave an affirmative answer to this question, arguing that the exact property, rather than monetary compensation in case of loss or damage, should be rendered back. Much later, in the early 20th century, Rashid Rida gave an affirmative answer to the question of whether or not Islam allows post-mortem examinations. In a fatwa he issued in 1908, he opined, there's another fatwa in 1910, both published in his Manar. He opined that post-mortem examinations were allowed since, quote, they were a worldly matter, min al-masail al-dunyawiyya, and not a religious one, laysat ibadah, unquote. The fatwa referred explicitly to the health regulations that had been placed in Egypt and said that the post-mortem examination, which aimed at determining the cause of death, was considered a public good, maslaha amma, and it should take precedence over the principle of dignifying the dead, takrim al-mayyit. In a later fatwa, the one I mentioned in 1910, he reiterated this line of thinking and said that the sunnah of prompt burial could be dropped if there existed the slightest doubt in determining the cause of death. But this is the 20th century. And Ibn Hazm and the other scholars that Savage-Smith studied date from a much earlier period, specifically from the 11th century. What about the scholars of 19th century Egypt, the one I'm actually interested in? Those scholars whom Klaw encountered. I found no fatwa from Egyptian ulama in the 19th century about dissection. The only explicit doctrinally based position of 19th century Egyptian ulama regarding dissection and post-mortem examinations in general relates to the question of the relates not to the question of the inscrutability of dead bodies, but to the question of delayed burials that such examinations necessarily entailed. Facing repeated complaints of delayed burials by members of the ulama, the ruler, Abbas Pasha, Mehmet Ali's grandson, issued strict orders that doctors had to conduct their post-mortem examinations promptly and set down clear punishments for those who failed to do so. The General Health Council, Majlis al-Sihha al-Umumi, which was in charge of all public hygiene matters, issued stern warnings to the resident doctors in all quarters of Cairo and other cities not to delay in checking dead bodies, and to give the matter their utmost priority. The directive specified that checking the dead should be conducted during daytime from 1 hour after sunrise to 1 hour before sunset. At the same time, however, strict orders were issued to local authorities not to be hasty in burying the dead. A waiting period of 8 hours in summer and 10 hours in winter was mandated. However, death had to be certified not by the sheikh, but by the village or neighborhood physician, and clear directives were given to him to avoid the grave error of mistaking fainting for death and thus burying people alive. In the numerous police cases that I consulted in the Egyptian archives, I found no evidence that the ulama's opposition to dissection was based on the reading of Islamic doctrine. There is no evidence in the records that the ulama believed that Muslim corpses could feel pain, as Klaw claimed. The only point of doctrine that was occasionally mentioned in the ulama's opposition to dissection, as I said, concerned delays in burial, and was not connected to any issue of dogma related to the sanctity of the human body. This is not to say that opposition was negligible or unimportant. However, this opposition, in my mind, can be better seen as stemming from the increasingly marginalized position that the religious establishment found itself in during the 19th century. With the new regulation stipulating that it was doctors, not the religious scholars, who could define death, some ulama must have felt that the expertise of Qasr al-Aini graduates challenged their monopoly on matters of burials and death, which had traditionally been their exclusive turf. While not doubting the veracity of Klaw's account with the Izhari ulama, therefore, I am skeptical about the meaning he gave it. In addition to factoring in his general anti-clerical stance, a stance he shared with many of his revolutionary compatriots regarding religion in general and not only Islam, I would also factor in the new social context in which the ulama found themselves, and would prefer to read the rare pronouncements about dissection in light of what they perceive to be a relative decline in their social status. If we move to Qasr al-Aini students, who in due course would replace their European teachers and assume the position of professors in their own alma mater, once again, I do not doubt the veracity of Klaw's account. That there was a stigma associated with dissecting bodies in Qasr al-Aini is not in doubt, nor is it contested that Klaw was indeed attacked by one of his students. The question, rather, is how correct Klaw was in arguing that this opposition to dissection stemmed from an Islamic doctrinal prohibition to opening up cadavers. For one thing, Klaw's paraphrasing of Sheikh al-Arusi's argument that cadavers could feel pain seems to be based on a misreading of the prophetic hadith: breaking the bones of a person when dead is like breaking them when living. A hadith that can be understood to censure grave robbers rather than set a prohibition on opening cadavers per se. For another, his allusion to the natural theology argument of the divine watchmaker betrays a presupposition that the violation of the divine prohibition on opening the inscrutable body was behind the opposition to dissection, a presupposition that has been seriously challenged for European societies as that of Renaissance Italy and Enlightenment France. In his groundbreaking study, Books of the Dead, Andrea Carlino argues that it was scholastic rigidity which was behind the strong academic hostility to dissection in medical schools. The overwhelming evidence of the ancient authorities and not church dogma outweighed the evidence of dissection, and the professors who conducted dissections to illustrate the validity of the ancient authors, quote, often did not believe what was actually before them, unquote, with the result that it took 2 centuries from Mondino to Vesalius, for sensory perception to establish itself decisively over the textual authority of the ancients. The disturbances that occasionally accompanied the dissection lessons, therefore, were not rooted in a perceived violation of church dogma about the inviolability of the human body. Rather, they, quote, might have been provoked by relatives and friends who protested the profanation of the remains of their loved ones, by spectators at dissections, by barbers and surgeons over the exorbitant fees, or by the controversies that could arise from the assignment of places normally distributed on the basis of the positions, seniority, and dignity of those present, unquote. Might similar concerns have informed the attitude of club-based students towards dissection? A number of those students were later sent to France to continue their medical education. Upon returning home, they translated the textbooks that they had studied in France and wrote lengthy introductions to these translations. As such, these writings and translations offer an important insight on the relationship between Islam and science in 19th century Egypt and allows us to examine what these former religious seminary students might have thought of dissection and how they reconciled their beliefs with their new medical profession. The eloquent introductions these students wrote for the books they translated show not only how much they viewed their scientific endeavors as deepening their belief in God, but also how these endeavors themselves were part of their faith. I spent many years trying to actually get hold of these books. These are the first publication of the Bulaq Press. Now, the Bulaq Press is celebrated rightly for what it did to Arabic literature, but for the first 25 years of its existence, the Bulaq Press was actually publishing medical books, medical and military books. The military books are what I studied in my earlier study. The medical books are fascinating. They are translations mostly from French, one or two from English, but not, of course, as I'm sure you understand, translation 19th century Egypt is not like translation now. These are authors and editors and language correctors who engaged with the texts that they were translating, very often inserting their own observations because they themselves are now teachers and medical practitioners. So even though we call them translations, there is, especially the introductions are very much their own voice. What do they say, these introductions? What do these authors say? They paid homage to Bichat and Lavoisier. They extolled Ibn Sina, Galen, and Hippocrates, and they profusely thanked the country's rulers for reviving an old science which they believed had been born in Egypt in the first place. Above all, however, it is God whom they thanked. Every single medical and chemical book that the Bulaq Press published in its first 50 years of its history started with a rhymed, spirited introduction praising God for his bounty and marveling at his creation. These introductions are craftily written, playing on some of God's attributes that are relevant to the topic of the book being translated. For example, the translators and editors of Bale's anatomy book on medicine, on anatomy, which appeared in Egypt a few years later in 1832 under the title القول الصريح في علم التشريح. This is the first medical book published in Egypt. Wrote in their introduction the following, quote, "Praise be to him who has created man in such good form, who composed his body of bones, nerves, veins, and cartridges, who expanded the chest," that is inspired, it's a play on the word sharaha as-sadr, "whoever wants to marvel at its form and constituent parts," unquote. A book on apothecary published in 1840 opened with the following words addressing the Almighty, quote, "You whose mere mention is the best remedy for man, and whose praise is the best antidote for hearts and bodies. Glory be to your majesty, in which the bodies of those who love you dissolve. The mere mention of you is a balsam that can cure all their ills, and praying to you is an elixir that can remedy all sickness." Unquote. Finally, the translators and editors of a chemistry book published in 1857 wrote in their introduction, quote, "You to whom pure souls rise and in whose majesty bodies dissolve, and on the thresholds of whose mercy bodies prostrate, your exalted being knows neither composition nor decomposition, and your sublime attributes do not change nor morph. There is no God but you, who has created for us earth with its metals, plants, and animals, and who has brought into being food that is sweet, sour, tasty, and salty." Unquote. This attitude of not seeing a contradiction between personal belief and Islamic doctrine on the one hand, and modern medicine and the practice of dissection on the other, is to be found most clearly in the works of Muhammad al-Shabasi, one of the early graduates of Qasr al-Aini. He graduated in the first class, 1832, was sent to France in 1832, spent 8 years, came back in 1840, and assumed very senior positions of teaching in his alma mater, and, like all his colleagues, had to translate one of the textbooks that he had studied in France as one condition for his employment. He chose a very difficult book to translate, nothing less than Cuvillier's famous book on dissection, on anatomy, that was published in 2 volumes between 1829 and 1842. He translated it and gave it a title, التنقيح الوحيد في الترشيح الخاص الجديد. In addition, al-Shabasi wrote a 1-volume textbook titled التنوير في قواعد التحضير as an aid for his students on how to prepare corpses for autopsy and how to conduct the autopsy itself. It was this latter book that was the basis of his fame. If we are to believe what he says of the book's effects on his students, it appears to have been a smashing success. Students were in the habit of taking corpses to their lodgings to learn more about human anatomy, and they did not find it problematic to sleep in the same rooms where dead bodies were kept, heedless of the criticism that this behavior necessarily triggered. This is a standard feature in anatomy textbooks in the 19th century, not only 19th century. It goes all the way back to Galen to highlight the significance of the text, and that, in fact, those who know the significance of the text would seek to practice it, even in their own lodgings. In the preface to his second book, this book, Al-Shabasi states, so this is not a translated book, this is an actually authored book in Arabic. Al-Shabasi states explicitly that, quote, "It is common knowledge among civilized nations that medicine cannot advance except by practicing dissection. Opening cadavers has many benefits. Among them are acquiring the knowledge of how healthy organs might have looked like immediately prior to death. It also enables us to identify pathological transformations that affect each organ and to compare them to symptoms detected just before death." And he gives a long list of medical reasons why dissection is important. Adding to these medical benefits, Al-Shabasi finds no problem in saying in the same breath, quote, that one of the benefits of medicine, of dissection, is to marvel at the precise functioning of the organs and meditating on God's creatures, which deepens and strengthens one's faith, unquote. He then paraphrases Galen as saying, "Reading anatomy books is the greatest of all acts of worship, and it forces one to acknowledge God's oneness," unquote. Throughout his book, Al-Shabasi follows the tradition of medieval Muslim physicians who saw no contradiction between their personal faith and their medical profession. This harmonious view of his Islam and his practice of dissection is seen most clearly in the conclusion, where he dwells on the importance of dissection for forensic medicine. I think this is brilliant. Quote, "The value of dissection can be illustrated by the example of 3 people who all drowned at the same time. Consequently, a problem of Islamic inheritance arises. Who died before whom? That is a key question in order to be able to divvy up the dissection. This problem can only be resolved if we determine who died first. Specifically, one person might have died after suffering from blood coagulation in the brain and then died of a stroke. The second by fainting, and the third struggled with drowning for some time, and eventually died of asphyxiation. In this case, the forensic doctor can deduce from the condition of the arteries, the veins, the hearts, the lungs, and the brain certain rational conclusions based on visual signs, not on guessing and surmising, ظن وتخمين. The same can be said in other similar cases, as when people die at the same time in an earthquake, collapse of a building, or a fire, unquote. In the very last remark, Al-Shabasi reminds his students of the importance and diligence in their work and cautions them not to jump to easy conclusions. Quote, when the forensic doctor comes across a dead body in the street, he should be very careful in how to determine the cause of death. For if he says that the victim had died as a result of a brain stroke, that is natural death, but when in fact death had been caused otherwise, that is unnaturally, then two errors will have been committed. First, the Shari'a stipulated capital punishment, Qasas, that is a retaliation, would have, from his murderer, would have been forsaken. And second, the case would have been recorded wrongly in the death registers. You remember this small piece of paper I mentioned earlier? This is what it was used for, to compile daily ledgers of every person dying in every neighborhood and every village. And these eventually would be tallied up by month, and that is what gave the state a statistical map to read and to detect epidemics, among many other things. The ease by which this former Azhari student, who held the chair of Professor of Physiology and Pathological Anatomy in Qasr al-Aini, could combine his understanding of Islam with his belief in the value of human dissection is a far cry from Klobbe's assertion that religious superstitions hampered his work in Egypt. In Shabasi's remarkable book, which was intended not for the general public, but for medical students, Al-Shabasi clearly explains how dissection could be of aid not only to medical education, but also to the proper collection of vital statistics, and what is most remarkable, to upholding the Islamic principle of retaliation for a medically proven case of homicide. If neither the ulama in 19th century Egypt nor the doctors of Qasr al-Aini seem to have posed serious objections to dissection, we reach the same conclusion when we examine the reaction to dissection by lower class Egyptians who appear not to have resisted or dismissed it outright. This is a document that I'm fond of. It's one of many petitions, but this petition goes exactly against what Klaw is saying. This is a petition by the residents of Port Said town, soon after the founding of the town, complaining that the resident doctor, whose name is Maji, obviously a European, is actually not conducting dissections, not conducting post-mortems properly. It turns out, and there is a follow-up, and you can see it's beautifully written, and also it has a beautiful line. وحيث أن العيا كاس داير على الناس. It's a beautiful line. Basically, there's an infant who died. The resident doctor was summoned. He came, he examined the body, and issued the death certificate, the burial certificate. When the religious authorities came to conduct the rituals and to cleanse the body and to put it in the shroud, the baby came back alive. Turns out, obviously, he had not died. And it turns out that the doctor had actually not paid a visit. In fact, he had sent his deputy, and that there is a market in these certificates. This is what the follow-up investigation had proven. So the residents of Port Said are horrified, and they're saying, this guy is not doing his job properly. He should come and conduct the postmortems personally and diligently, because, they say it beautifully here, we are terrified of being buried alive. It's only the doctors who could prevent us from this most horrible death. And they write this petition. Now, to be sure, the sight of or even the contact with dead bodies must have evoked feelings of horror, disgust, and shock. And as Savage Smith observes, cutting into a corpse for dissection rather than postmortems, especially a human one, is a messy and painstaking endeavor which under the best conditions requires a strong motivation to carry out. However, police and court records that I have consulted for the past quarter of a century in the archives in Egypt show that as disturbing as they might have considered autopsy, lower-class Egyptians not infrequently insisted on an autopsy when they suspected that a loved one had been murdered, and that the only way to achieve justice was by asking, during the inquest, for an external post-mortem examination, even if this sometimes entailed exhuming the body. It is this quest for justice that trumped any religious or cultural opposition to dissection. And it is this quest of justice that led me to the particular choice of title for my forthcoming book. Let me then end with a case that best illustrates the Egyptians' readiness to use forensic medicine to protect their rights and to achieve justice. This is one of many cases that I have found. Some from Cairo, others from the countryside. Some are dealing with Copts, some with Muslims. Upper class and lower class. This is a case of a woman called Mahbouba, a young woman from a small village in the Minya province in Upper Egypt, about 200 kilometers south of Cairo. It is a case that sums up what the creation of a modern state meant for common Egyptians, how the state deployed techniques that enabled it to lay claims on their bodies, and how they in turn fought back to reclaim their bodies. In the summer of 1857, Mahbouba's husband, Ali Gadallah, was summoned for corvée labor on the Cairo-Suez railway line, the first railway line built in Egypt. On the way to perform his duty, Ali escaped, prompting his village Sheikh Muhammad al-Sha'rawi, to search for him at all costs. He went to Ali's home, thinking that he had preferred to stay in the comfort of his small family, composed of his wife, Mahbouba, their young son, and his mother-in-law. When Sheikh Sha'rawi could not find Ali, he arrested his wife instead, Mahbouba, and had her imprisoned in the village jail. While in custody, he beat her severely to confess as to her husband's whereabouts. Eventually, and realizing that his severe beatings may lead to her death, Sha'rawi had Mahbouba delivered to her home, where she soon died. At this point, Ali, the husband, appeared from hiding, and together with his mother-in-law, that is Mahbouba's mother, they together went to the local Shari'a court to bring charges against Sha'rawi, accusing him of causing Mahbouba's death. That's the standard way to deal with suspected homicide cases. What was a bit unusual is they actually brought Mahbouba's body wrapped in a shroud in front of the Qadi and demanded a post-mortem examination. Both the Qadi But the Qadi refused the request, saying that only a physician could undertake such an examination. He then proceeded to deal with the case as is the norm in a Sharia court. He questioned Sha'rawi about the charge, but Sha'rawi denied all accusations. The Qadi then asked the claimants if they had any witnesses to the act of beating, but they answered that since the beating had taken place in jail, they could provide no witnesses. Finally, the Qadi asked them to fetch the village corpse washer to inquire from her if she had detected any contusions on Mahbouba's body while preparing it for burial. But as luck would have it, the woman who performed this ritual in the village happened to be Mahbouba's mother, whose testimony could therefore not be accepted and who, in addition, was blind. Lacking a confession by the defendant or an eyewitness account, the Qadi therefore could not rule for the defendants, and the case had to be dropped according to fiqh. But as I have discovered in so many other cases, there existed a parallel legal system, the Siyasa system, that did accept forensic medicine as a way to establish proof. And in fact, this forensic medicine was called Siyasa medicine. And the doctor is called Tabib Siyasi, Hakim Siyasi. So what Ali and his mother-in-law did, they didn't give up. They took the body and, confronted by what they believed was the prejudice of the Qadi, all the locals, the agriculture overseers and the local sheikhs, they took Mahbouba's body, hurled it on top of a camel, and roamed the countryside, seeking the help of a doctor, Hakim Siyasi, who could conduct a post-mortem examination. Finally, the provincial town of Qurusna, the deputy doctor there, answered the request. In his report, he wrote that he, quote, had found signs of severe beatings by a palm leaf, garida, on the deceased's chest up to her face and from her shoulders down to her wrists, and that blood had been oozing out of her mouth. Unquote. He concluded by saying that Mahbouba's death had been caused by beating. The claimants felt vindicated and, quote, clung to what had been revealed by the doctor's report. تمسكوا بما توضح بكشف الحكيم. Based on the medical report, the police found Muhammad al-Sha'rawi guilty of causing Mahbouba's death and sentenced him to 5 years in prison. There is no better case than Mahbouba's to illustrate both the degree to which the Egyptian state in a little less than half a century had managed to establish firm control over the natural resources of the country, as well as the resourcefulness with which Egyptians accommodated this new machine that controlled all aspects of their lives from birth to death. This tragic story illustrates how there was little about this modern state that Egyptians could be happy with. Egypt could indeed pride itself on being the first country outside Europe and North America to build railways. The Cairo-Suez railway line, completed just 1 year following Mahbouba's death, is a good example not only of the diplomatic and technical proficiency that the Egyptian state had achieved by mid-century, but also of the efficient policing and precise census taking that allowed tens of thousands of peasants like Ali Gadallah to be pressed in corvée in order to make possible the rail link between Cairo and Suez. For Mahbouba, however, the Cairo-Suez railway line and the modern state that lay behind it were an unmitigated disaster. Her husband was dragged to the corvée. She herself was abducted by the village strong man and ended up paying with her life for a project that could hardly be less relevant to her happiness and well-being. What Mahbouba's case illustrates is how resourceful and quick non-elite Egyptians were in appropriating the novel techniques of the state for their own purposes. This state might not have been created to serve them. It might have controlled their bodies in ever tighter ways. It might have even extended its gaze beyond life and subjected the dead to close scrutiny. But as Mahbouba's husband and mother show, Egyptians, in their quest for justice, spared no effort to make the state serve them, and they stopped at nothing in their constant struggle to live in peace and die with dignity. Thank you very much.
You want to field your own questions?
Yeah, I might as well. I just get a...
Okay, I'll start with that. And was there somebody else? Who? Ah, okay, please. No.
Either way, go ahead. Thank you, Professor Fahmy, for another rich and textured talk, as always. Very powerful ending. I'm still digesting that, so apologies if the question takes a minute to come out. So before the ending, I was thinking about the parallels while you were talking about these physicians. I forgot their names, but it sounds like a generation of physicians that are synthesizing, maybe that's not the best word, continuing, evolving, the notion of Islam and modernity as it pertains to medicine. That is, of course, the sort of broad theme. I couldn't help but thinking within that broad theme of Islam and modernity, or of parallels in the legal realm. Figures like Jevdet Pasha, figures like the young Ottomans, figures like later on in the 20th century, Abdurrazak Sanhuri and so forth, who are trying to synthesize, again, for lack of a better term, notions of Sharia and modernity, Sharia and codification, law stuff. And you're bringing in these really fascinating cases of medicine. So my question for you is this a generational thing or generational phenomenon that goes far beyond medicine? Or is there a something specific about medicine that you're arguing in your book? Thank you.
Thank you. This is a wonderful question, and it allows me to say a couple of things about the legal aspect that I didn't really have time. I mean, the reason it took me a quarter of a century to finish the book is that I had to find out about this legal thing. Let me just step back and say the following. I did not actually find freestanding forensic medical reports. What I found were police and legal records in which a medical report is incorporated as part of a larger case dossier. And that attracted my attention because, in the midst of this legal case, you have a verbatim quotation from an extensive medical report that I wanted to understand where it came from. And I tried to share with you how I attempted to find out who these doctors were, where they were trained, and how they came up to write these reports. Once I did this, I then asked myself, well, wait a minute, what is this legal system in which these medical reports are incorporated? Because this is not the familiar Sharia court registers, but they're also not the familiar modern legal system that we assume we know. This is something that doesn't exist in scholarship. And not only among scholars, but also among legal practitioners. My father is a judge, and he doesn't know anything about this. And the secondary literature about Egyptian legal history is completely silent about this, with a few exceptions, most notably Rood Peters in Amsterdam, and another young scholar, Ahmed Hilal, who is Egyptian, who teaches now in Saudi Arabia, and your humble servant. I mean, 3 people, really. And we're talking about a huge corpus of records. We're talking about, in fact, an archive, an entire archive of a legal system. There's something like 4,000 ledgers covering something like 30 years, from the early 1850s to the early 1880s. So it's a long period, and it's a fascinating legal system. What this legal system basically was these are councils, not courts, headed by administrators, not judges, and they were entrusted with keeping peace in the realm, including investigating murder cases. So what we see, like Mahbouba's case, is that the Sharia courts were existing and functional completely and authorized, and they have to adjudicate the case first. But not first, but simultaneously, there is a police, there is this state that I explained, and they also do their own investigations. And my book tells the story of this legal system and how differently they go about investigating a case like homicide, and how more reliant they were on circumstantial evidence, which is not acceptable in Sharia court when it comes to homicide. You have to have a confession or an eyewitness account. And these councils were very readily accepting of relying on circumstantial evidence, the prime example of which is forensic medicine, is the forensic medical report. So this is just a summary of what this legal system was. To come to your question then, what I find, there's nothing peculiar about medicine, the short answer to your question is. But the key for me to answer your question, to think about it, is to, as I said at the very beginning, is to, in fact, privilege practice. I see these practitioners. these practitioners they have not received legal education. They did not go to law school. They are not trained in Islamic law. They are ex-military officers who are now appointed to these councils, and these councils grow, and when they grow, they generate their own rules and their own mechanisms and their own bylaws and their own language. And they elaborate. I mean, this does not also exist out of vacuum. This is an old, venerable Ottoman Islamic tradition that can be traced all the way back to the very beginning of Islamic law. It just has not been privileged in the scholarship because we study Shari'a courts. We do not study siyasa councils or mazalim or qanun. So this is qanun. This is qanun in action. And what we see is these qanunis, these siyasa practitioners, they have their own logic. And I've seen them dealing with cases, and they generate laws. They generate principles. They generate ideas. And the theory comes out of practice. So this is one way of answering the question. The second important point is that there is, in addition to what I'm saying, there is, however, also a generational divide. Because all of these people, not only the physicians I study and the legal practitioners I study and the bureaucrats I follow, and also I would assume, with the exception of Tahtawi, he's the anomaly. Tahtawi is the one person who views the encounter with Europe in identitarian language. These people have no issue. The identity is not an issue for them. It becomes an issue a generation or two later. It is with the Muhammad Abdus and, of course, Rashid Rizas later on. The question for me is why? Why, when the encounter happened, including Jabarti. Jabarti, for him, when you read Jabarti, who saw this clash in 1798, with Napoleon coming in with his cannons and so on. And Jabarti, when he reflects on quarantines, the quarantine measures that the French impose, or indeed the legal innovations that they introduce, he asks not identity questions. He asks questions of expediency, efficiency, and justice, and health. And he says, these quarantine measures are good. You know, we want more of them, but we want them, like these Port Said residents, to be applied with diligence. And he asks political questions, not questions of identity. The question of identity becomes a pressing one, as we know in our scholarship, when it rears its head at the turn of the 20th century, and this has to do, in my mind, with good old-fashioned colonialism. For the fact that these guys have actually lost control of the wonderful edifice that they had created. If I can bring out one thing that I have been touched by in all of this, I mean, I've lived with these guys in the archives and reading their documents for a long, long time, the most infectious, not infectious, but I wish I were infected by it. The most touching thing that comes across from them is the degree of self-confidence they had. It's not that they had an answer to every problem, but they thought they had a mechanism to find an answer eventually, so they can tamper with it. I mean, this business about vital statistics. There is a fascinating report in 1872 about the state of statistics, vital statistics, and they said something is wrong. We have improved health conditions, general sanitation, introduced smallpox vaccination. Our mortality figures is still high. And it's still high compared to what? To Boston, Vienna, Madrid, London, Paris, 8 cities, European cities. And And the reason why they could make an argument like this is that they have this edifice. They could read the city statistically. And they said, well, we don't know what more we can do. And then by the end of the document, they say, no, we have to read these figures carefully. And when they read the figures carefully, they start making distinctions between neighborhoods, and they discover that it is not eating habits, it's not religion, it's not the climate, it is population density. It is the number of inhabitants per household. And from this, they deduce that the answer to Egypt's bad mortality figures, Kairos, is to expand horizontally and to start going beyond the city murals. This gesture I found in so many other, these are people who have a state, they've created a state structure, and they can read and fine-tune it. I can only imagine the shock that they found and felt when that machine was snatched from them. And we can see it. This is the scholarship that people in Oxford and Aaron Jakes, our friend, and Matt Ellis, and all those amazing people, our younger generation of scholars working on Egypt in the 1890s to try and answer exactly this question: how the Egyptian bureaucrats tried to put up a strong fight against the British occupying authorities that attempted to control these. Again, this is why this is not the same as in India. There's something else happening here. It's a different story. So there is a generational divide. The 1890s is not like the 1850s. And definitely the 1930s are different from the 1830s. And it has to do with a degree of self-confidence that these people were having. And it is ideas. So this is one point. The second is that practice for me comes first in understanding how ideas float. There's a question first at the back, and then
he deferred to me, so mine is a short one. So the idea, the question of who to whom does the body belong? It's a question that also today anthropologists are also going back to sort of look at that answers. My question though is a bit different. There must have been other bodies in Egypt at the time, and you referred briefly to blacks, for example, or you could have thought about the Christians, the Copts. I mean, is it really a question that just refers to the Muslim body, or is it a question that refers to every dead body that couldn't be tampered with in dissection and so forth? I've just wanted to, I'm trying to get a sense of what's so Islamic about a dead body.
Yeah. There is as I said, I think to answer this question, we have to make a distinction between the dissection in the medical school and dissection autopsies for forensic legal purposes. From what I see, which are the legal records, they do not make distinctions with regards to a case of suspected death. They do not ask whether this was a Muslim body or a Christian body or a Jewish body or an Armenian body. That has to be investigated in order to allow it to be buried. They don't. I mean, it's mentioned, of course, that this person is Christian or whatever, but that is not the way it is identified. I think the quote from Klaw about "we will not touch except," he actually says Negroes in the French. He uses the word. Is a difficult question for all people working on history of dissection in medical schools, because this is usually there's always a problem for medical schools to secure these bodies. And the literature now about European practice in Italian cities in the 16th century and earlier, like the book I mentioned and others, revolve around this, how the municipal authorities actually tried to control this this practice in collaboration with the church. The church did not oppose. But there was and of course in the 19th century in England, there is body snatching, which is what prompted the Anatomy Act to be passed in 1832. There's a huge literature on this. This is a contested practice, how to secure for the medical school a steady supply of bodies, whose bodies would be snatched. We don't really know. I have to admit, I haven't found, except Klopbe's polemical argument, trying to placate an ostensibly hostile opinion. But this is his version. But I haven't found the records. But the way I would go about thinking about it is, again, to go back to this literature to say that this is a difficult practice for all kinds of reasons, especially in Egypt. Before refrigeration, this is a difficult practice for a medical school to do. And one aspect would be religious, but I don't think this would be the only or even the most important question that would inform a policy like that of Qasr al-Aini and how to secure this the supply of dead bodies.
Khaled, thank you very much for a talk that has implications on so many fields of study, really, and I have a million questions, but I want to just go to the rooftop view for just a second and formulate it in terms of your opening statement and your closing statement. The opening statement was about the Nahda, which often has been debated as religion and versus secularism to a certain extent, in which case you talked about science and Shari'a. But in the closing section of the talk, you mentioned the quest for justice as something that can trump both science and religion. But then you gave the story of Mahbuba, which talked about how the relationship between the lower classes and the state was not just a top-down, it could be a bottom-up process, in which case the real distinction was, again, science versus Sharia, because they were not happy with the local qadi, but they went to Tabib Siyasi and they found some sort of justice there, which takes us back again to the very thing that you were seeking to undermine. So I'm wondering if you can just clarify. Did I read you correctly?
No. There is a tension in the conclusion. Yes. I mean, because I try to deal with these ideas. I mean, these are the questions that I'm grappling with in the book, and this is why it took me so long to try and reconcile them. There are different kinds of questions. I think Mahbuba's story, again, the way in the reaction, in the reflection to the first question, I don't think it is that they preferred science over religion. The document has interesting insights into how they thought of the Qadi as complicit with the local power structure. These are the local notables. They sit together, these men behind closed doors, and they suck our blood out. And this is something that some of the documents explicitly say. They refer to this hostility. And the existence of the Siyasa councils was actually one way of dealing with this. What happens if the Qadi is corrupt or incompetent? We cannot remove him. We cannot tell him what to judge. Of course, Qada within Islam has a very elaborate mechanism to deal with this through the udul witnesses, and I think one layer of this is the siyasa in the 19th century. These were not two separate systems of law. They actually belong together. And the practitioners, the claimants in this case, they understood this, that this is not two separate things. But I think if I were to think aloud with you about what this case also says, is that what they are betting on is that these new doctors can actually serve them. They might have been trained for state purposes, as I've said, collection of statistics and so on. But it doesn't mean that we cannot approach them and ask them to rescue us. And it is contested. It's which way they will go. Qadis are not always corrupt or incompetent, and very often in the archives we see the Qadi actually passing a death sentence against the local Umda. But this is only if some brave man stepped forward to witness and testify against him, which is very rare, and that is why we have the siyasa. So that to deal with the shortcomings of fiqh when it comes to establishing proof, especially when it comes to the lack of eyewitnesses. But I think the best way to answer your question is to think in the very momentous weeks and months of the revolution in Egypt. Because, frankly, this book came together in my mind. I remember the day distinctly. I remember it very, very clearly. It was November of 2011, and I went to the Cairo morgue in solidarity with a family of someone whom the police had killed. A young man called Asam Ata, been arrested a few days after the outbreak, in the middle of the revolution. He was arrested by the military police on suspicion that he's a thug, Baltagi, and arrested without his parents and his family knowing where he is. Presented to a court, a military court, and sentenced in 3 days, receiving 5 years. His family looked for him. Finally, they found him serving his prison sentence in a prison in Cairo. His mother goes to visit him, and she gives him a SIM card to be able to phone her from prison. And it's illegal, but there's a market for it, obviously, there's a market for everything inside the prison. A snitch reported him. The police decided to, the prison wardens decided to teach him a lesson, and they decided to, I'm sorry, I'm going to say, they decided to flush out the SIM card because he swallowed it to hide the evidence. So they decided to flush it out. So they inserted a water hose from both ends, and he exploded. And he died in Qasr al-Aini shortly afterwards. So we've been following the case, and I went. And of course, this is typical. This is what the Egyptian police do. And this happened in prison, but it happens also in police stations and in other illegal places of incarceration throughout the country. So the family decided, so we went to the morgue because there was now a court injunction for an autopsy. And I remember going there and seeing a young man on his mobile having an argument with someone I didn't know who this person was. Of course, it's a horrible sight and horrible place, and the whole place is really physically also very disturbing. Turns out that this is the brother of Asam Ata, a young man called Muhammad Ata, who was arguing with his uncle, who didn't want a confrontation with the police, wanted to bury the body. And Muhammad was saying, no, we will open him up. Come what may. هنفتحه يعني هنفتحه. This is what he said. I'll never forget this. And suddenly something like a very strong deja vu feeling, came to me. Like, I've seen this before. And of course, I haven't seen it. It was my first time in the morgue. Sadly, it wasn't the last time. But I had read about it. I mean, these are the cases I've been reading. It's exactly this, of a moment in which people know who had caused the death of their loved ones, and they seek justice in this way, knowing the very heavy price that will be paid. Muhammad, till today, hasn't managed to find the person who killed his brother, but he hasn't given up. Muhammad, back then, this is a very, very poor family, very poor in Cairo. Muhammad was 28 years old, illiterate. Today, Muhammad finished school and is suing the Egyptian government in front of local tribunals. Of course, he failed, and he's suing them in front of the African Commission of Human Rights. It is these gestures that I think are key, and again, we've seen it. What we call the massacre of the Stade الدفاع الجوي. Football hooligans, we know that the state targeted them because they are shouting against the police. They killed them. 27 people were killed in what the state claims to have been a stampede. They say it's not a stampede. You fired tear gas in an enclosed place to kill us. The question rested on what the autopsy report says. The families of the victims went to the morgue and refused to receive their bodies because the death certificates that were issued did not specify the true cause of death. So it is this, and you see it, by the way, this is on video. You can see it on YouTube. This scene on YouTube where the parents saying, we are not receiving the bodies of our sons. We're going home unless you give us death certificates that state the exact cause of death. Why? Because this is the beginning of litigation. Without it, they cannot start a process of litigation. And litigation is important. Closure does not come because you perform the rituals of death and had the aza to receive the condolences and did your prayers. Closure comes with receiving justice. And in these circumstances, there's no closure without proper justice. And the question is, who's going to deliver it? For me, this is what the question is. Again, it's not a question of identity. It's not a question of science versus religion. It's what is more expedient than the other. Now, the doctors have failed us because the Egyptian medical authority is completely complicit with the state, despite the fact that it is not part of the Ministry of Interior and it's part of the Ministry of Health. But the Egyptian syndicate of doctors syndicate, as well as the entire medical establishment, cannot stand up to Sisi and what he's doing. They are completely cowardly, and what they are doing is that they are eroding whatever good reputation they might have once had with the Egyptian people. I think this is what is at stake.
Thank you very much. We have to give up the room at 2 and we're 7 minutes late, but it was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks.